Good afternoon. I am so excited to be with all of you. Thank you so much for inviting me, and to get the chance to spend time with some of my friends, I think is absolutely remarkable too. Aurelia, I love her. Have you guys gotten the chance to know her a little bit? She's amazing, isn't she? Yeah. And she gave my whole speech for me, so now I don't even have to say anything real important. I just get to spend some time with all of you sharing a few thoughts. And listen, I'm the governor of the great state of South Dakota, but I think the most important thing for all of you to know about me today is that I'm a grandma. So there's a couple things that happens when you become a grandma. And I was always, frankly, I'll tell you, for years was a little bit irritated by all you grandparents in the room, because you would always go on and on and on about how amazing it was to be grandparents. And I just kept thinking, there's no way it can be that great. And then my daughter Cassidy and son-in-law Kyle had Miss Addie. Her name's Adeline West Peters, and everything changed. She is brilliant. She's absolutely brilliant. It's amazing. She's 2 years old now, and she has a little brother named Branch, who's 6 months old now. But the other day we had the chance to go to my mother's birthday party. My mom turned 75, and so Miss Addie came with her mom and dad, and the whole family was together. But I'm sorry, I'm telling a grandma story right away, but Addie spent a half hour with me on the floor trying to get me to teach her to tie her shoes. At age 2, she kept saying, tie. So I'm sorry, but at 2 years old, I said to Cassidy, I said, she is so much smarter than you kids were. And Cassidy said, no, she's not. You just are paying a lot more attention to her than you did us. You were working all the time when we were growing up. But I thought, at 2 years old, if this little girl learns how to tie her shoes, she gets to be the next president of the United States, right? We could use a Miss Addie right now. The best thing about being a grandma is you get to lose your filter. And I think that what's going on in this country right now, all of us are a little bit ready to lose our filters, aren't we? We're looking for a little more normal human beings that are genuine, that will tell the truth. So today I'm just going to have a conversation with all of you. I want to share with some of you my background, my story. Some of you, how many of you have never heard me speak before? Quite a few. So I'll tell you a little bit about who I am, because I'm guessing that most of you in this room have maybe never even heard my name until probably 3 or 4 years ago, when it was during the COVID pandemic, and night after night on the national news, the liberals were kicking me in the head. And they were kicking me in the head for the decisions that I was making in South Dakota. Rachel Maddow, Elizabeth Warren were calling me dangerous, irresponsible for the decisions that I was making. But I'll tell you, my people were happy. And they were happy because they were free. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a background and an understanding of how I make my decisions, not just as governor, but as a person. And I think in order for you to know that, you need to know me and how I grew up. I grew up as the daughter of a rancher and his wife. My dad was very, very tough. In fact, he was the kind of guy that woke us up every single day by yelling up the stairs, "Get up. More people die in bed than anywhere else." And I remember being a little girl laying in bed thinking, is that true? Yeah. And we got up and headed downstairs early and worked with our family. We were always together. He taught us a work ethic and the value of being together as a family, and created children that knew how to tackle problems. Often I just remember not being able to figure him out and what he was doing. He never once taught us really to do anything. He just had us do it. For instance, I was about 12 years old when my dad and I were leaving the field. We were big farmers and ranchers in the state of South Dakota, had one of the largest operations at the time. And we were leaving a field after harvesting corn with a semi-load of corn, and I was sitting in the passenger seat of the semi, and we got going down the road, and Dad turned to me, and he said, "Oh my goodness, I forgot I got to bring the other truck home. Here, Kristi, jump over here, take the wheel, make your corners wide, and I'll meet you at home," and jumped out the door. So I dove across the cab, grabbed the steering wheel, immediately started to cry, and started to drive home the 7 miles that I had to get to the farm. I took the widest corners you've ever seen. I didn't even shift all the way home because I didn't know how. And I remember when I got back into the farmyard, I didn't know how to stop the semi. And so all I could do was just turn it off and let it drift to a stop. I remember as it slowly drifted to a stop, the first thought that went through my head was, I cannot believe that I lived. And the second thought that went through my head was, I bet I can drive anything now. And that's what I think was the greatest gift that my dad gave me, is he gave us impossible things to do. He gave us hard things to do that we never dreamed that we could accomplish. And by doing that, he developed children that became problem solvers. In fact, one thing that he did to me when I was younger, too, we were out fixing fence one day, and he turned to me and he said, where's the post pounder? Have you guys ever built a fence with the post maul and the post pounder? I said, it's in the pickup. He said, go get it right now. And I could tell he was mad at me that I didn't have it there. So I ran to the pickup, because all you do with Dad is run to get whatever he needs, got back to him, handed it to him, and when I handed it to him, he said, you should know what I need before I know what I need. And I remember standing there as a 10-year-old girl thinking, how would I ever know what he needs before he knows what he needs? But he was teaching us to think 3 steps ahead of him, to always be prepared for whatever situation was coming, so he never had to wait, he never had to lose time, he could be efficient, and to solve problems before they really became a problem. As an adult, as a business owner, as serving in the state legislature, in Congress, and as governor, over and over again, I have learned that that is the greatest gift my family gave me, was to helping me think strategically, think ahead, 3 steps from where everybody else was, to be a problem solver, and then the fact that they gave me the confidence to tackle bigger things all the time, I think was a great gift. That's what we need in this country for our kids, frankly. We are crippling our children in this country, and we're crippling them. We're crippling them because we have people doing everything for them. If you are parents and grandparents today, stop doing things for your kids. Our job is not to do everything for them and solve their problems, it's to prepare them for life. And they should have to do hard things. They should have to do hard things that gives them the confidence to take on the next biggest things that come. So it's not always that fun to challenge them, but the best gift that you can give them is to prepare them for life. Because if you look out across the landscape in this country right now, we've got some challenging times ahead. But the one thing that I wanted to talk to you all about a little bit today is hope. I talk a lot about freedom. I think people say, oh, Governor, all you ever talk about is freedom. Well, I've never seen a time in our history where we saw the government in such a short period of time try to take away people's freedoms. Because the government told people that they couldn't gather in groups together, people rolled over and gave over their freedom of assembly. Because the government during the pandemic told people that they couldn't go to church, they gave up their freedom of religion. Because the government is letting social media platforms and the media tell them what people can say and what they can't say, they're giving up their freedom of speech. So I've never seen our freedoms more challenged, and I've never seen people use fear to try to control people the way that we've seen the last several years. So freedom's important, and we need to remind people about the greatest gift that freedom is to us and to this generation and previous generations. But right now, people are desperate for hope. Thomas Jefferson, in his inaugural address, talked about us being the world's best hope. Abraham Lincoln said we were the last best hope. Where will we go if we lose this country? Where else is there somewhere better than the United States of America? We are still the hope to the world. The rest of the world looks at us, watches us, our actions and how we speak, and they gather hope from that or they lose hope. So while it's so hard to define really what hope is, today I want to talk a little bit about it, because from now on we don't have to guess what hope is. All you have to do is look at the state of South Dakota. You see, I have learned in many, many years of lessons that I've seen is that leadership has consequences. All you have to do is to look from state to state the last several years and saw that it really mattered who was in leadership during those times. And every state is doing differently according to who was in leadership. All we did in South Dakota the last several years, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, is that we just did what conservatives have always said that they believed. We just did it and it worked. Now, my background growing up in a farm and a ranch and a business was critical to forming the person that I am. But I also think that for all of us, we need to tell our stories, because that's how we inspire people to do better. I tell people every day when I leave them, I say, just be better. Today we can be better than we were the day before. Yesterday we may have failed. Yesterday I may have screwed up. But today we have the chance to be better. Now, growing up, all I wanted to do was to be a farmer and rancher like my dad. He was tough, he was a cowboy. If you thought of John Wayne, that was pretty much my dad. So I knew, even when I went to college, that I wanted to grow up and end up coming home, taking over our family businesses and work beside him every single day. The only problem was when I was in college is that my dad was killed in an accident on our farm. He was 49 years old at the time, and it was devastating for our family. I remember the next day, not even sleeping all night long, thinking, how are we ever going to get through this? He was the one person in my life that I thought was irreplaceable. I couldn't even see the next 24 hours without him. Then we learned within several weeks and the first couple of months after he passed away that we were going to be hit with the death tax, the estate tax. So at the time, I was 22 years old. I was married. I was about 8 months pregnant when my dad passed away because I'd gotten married when I was 20, and we were farmers and ranchers, and that's what you do. You have kids that can help you work on the farm and the ranch, right? So we were on it. We were making babies. So I was 8 months pregnant when my dad passed away, and then I learned within just a couple of months that we owed death taxes. At the time, the federal estate tax was 55% of whatever you owned. Now, if you can imagine my dad at age 49, we were farming thousands of acres. We had hundreds of cattle. We had large operation, but we didn't have any money in the bank. We were like a lot of business owners in this country, especially small business owners, that we had assets, but that didn't necessarily mean that we had cash flow that was there and readily available. I could not believe that we had this tragedy that occurred to our family, and all of a sudden the federal government was threatening taking away our family business because of their tax policy. In fact, I learned very quickly about what an unfair tax it was. It was the only place in our tax code where we double taxed someone, and it made me angry. I ended up quitting college, coming home, taking over the operation, and it took me 10 years to pay off those taxes. I went from banker to banker trying to get them financed and couldn't get them financed all by one banker. I finally got one that took a chance on me, and he also went out and found a couple of wealthy farmers that would loan me the rest. And I went out and started a hunting lodge to make more money off of the assets that we had so we could farm it, ranch it, and hunt on that property. We started a custom harvesting business. My mom went out and bought a restaurant because she thought that would be fun. I don't know if any of you are in the restaurant industry, but it's a very tough industry. So within about 6 months, I was managing her restaurant for her as well. She said, Kristi, I thought I would sit in the front booth and have coffee with my friends all day. But it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. But in 10 years, we did pay off those taxes. But it made me angry. So people ask me all the time how I got involved in government and politics. It was through that. That I knew that if we had owned a gas station, if we had owned a different small business, the only way that we could have paid those taxes was to sell our family business. And I knew that that shouldn't be the story of the American family. So I started to show up at meetings. At the time, the U.S. Senate Majority Leader was Mr. Tom Daschle from the state of South Dakota. I became a thorn in his side. I showed up at all of his meetings. I was passionate about tax reform. And after a period of time, he appointed me to a committee that oversaw all the federal farm programs in the state. So with USDA and ran those programs, and then ended up being recruited to run for the state legislature. I decided to run because in South Dakota, you can be a citizen legislator. South Dakota has a legislature that's only in session for 40 days a year. So they're all citizens. They show up. It's wonderful as governor, because as governor, they're there for about a month and a half, and then they leave again for the rest of the year. But I decided I could, my husband and I, together with our 3 kids at the time, that I could still run our businesses, be the general manager, but I could go and contribute to our legislature and do that and do them all well. So I ran for the legislature, was there about a week, and I recognized that leadership controlled everything, and decided if I was going to be away from my family and if I was going to be away from our businesses, then I was going to be as impactful as possible. So I ran to be the assistant majority leader in the House and was elected to that as my colleagues. While I served in the legislature, I rewrote our property tax system in South Dakota. We had a lot of people at the time that were being taxed off their property and couldn't afford their property taxes. Now remember, South Dakota doesn't have an income tax. We don't have a personal property tax. We basically have a 4.5-cent sales tax, which just this year we cut. But at that time, our property taxes were overpriced and many people were struggling with it. So I rewrote our property tax system, and then people started to talk to me about running for Congress. My husband and I had no desire to go to Congress. In fact, for 2 years, we kept saying no. We had a Democrat that represented South Dakota in the U.S. House. And most people don't think about South Dakota being a state that would elect a lot of Democrats, but we're a very populist state. We're pretty conservative now, but previously, even back then, we had a full Democrat delegation that represented us in Congress. We had a blue dog Democrat that represented the state, and Senator John Thune knew that she was coming after him in his next election and thought that if someone could beat her in her first reelection for the representative job before she would challenge him, that would take care of his problem too. So his folks kept recruiting me for a couple of years to try to run for Congress and kept sending people to me, frankly, from all over the country to say, would you run against her and beat her? Although she had a 90% approval rating in South Dakota. She was one of the last few blue dog Democrats, did not vote for Obamacare, did not vote for the stimulus package. The only thing that she had done that I really could talk about in a campaign against her was that she voted for Nancy Pelosi. So when Brian and I finally decided to run, we talked about Nancy Pelosi a lot. But that was really the decision that we made is, listen, maybe we should just run. And if we lose, then they'll leave us alone. And they won't bother us anymore with this idea of going to Washington, D.C. We got into that race, and it became very competitive and ended up being one of the top 5 races in the nation that year. And I ended up winning that race and getting elected to represent South Dakota in the U.S. House. That was in 2010. When I got to Congress, of course, I was passionate again about tax reform. Sponsored a complete repeal of the death tax, but served on many different committees, served on the Ag Committee, Education and Workforce Committee, on Armed Services Committee, which I appreciated very much because I had the chance to go to many different countries, the DMZ, war zones, Afghanistan. Took a lot of those trips with the leadership team in the House because I was elected to the leadership team there as well, but then ended up on the Ways and Means Committee, which is the committee that many people described to me as the one that had the most ways it could be mean. So the Ways and Means Committee has jurisdiction over all tax policy, a lot of healthcare policy, trade policy. About 80% of what goes through the House goes through the Ways and Means Committee. And I was excited to get put on that committee so I would have the chance to do tax reform, and was absolutely thrilled when we elected President Trump, who was passionate about tax reform too. Had the chance to work on that bill. Had the chance to work on that bill for 2 years, and to see it signed into law was a wonderful opportunity for me. And then I decided that after being there for 8 years and getting the chance to work on several National Defense Authorization Acts, to do tax reform, do farm bills, that I really wanted to look at the opportunity to become governor of South Dakota. People had asked me to consider it, and I realized that being a governor is very different than serving in Congress. In Congress, you get the chance to work on bills. You can talk about policy. You can give a lot of speeches and press conferences. But governors are CEOs. Governors get up every single day and get the chance to make decisions, to have an agenda. And I recognized that the state of South Dakota was a small state, and frankly, our state had been dying. Our state had been shrinking, people had been leaving. Our kids and grandkids were having to leave to get careers somewhere else. Our economy was stagnant. We didn't have new industries that had come in the last 30 years. And I recognized that we needed a governor, a CEO, that had a vision for the future of building stronger families, but also growing our state. So I decided to run for governor and went into a race that we did all the polling before I made the decision to run. And I remember I had about 2 or 3 hours to make the decision on if I was going to run for governor before my paperwork had to be filed to get it done. And I got the polling results back just those 2 hours before I had to make the decision and file the paperwork. I called my husband and he said, well, what did the polls say? I said, well, frankly, it's not good. It said I'm going to lose the primary by 12 points and that I'm going to lose the general by 8 points, that it says that there's no way that I can win. And frankly, the polling showed that while I had done a good job in Congress, that South Dakota wasn't ready to have a female governor, that it was a big factor for them to have a young woman come in, and to see her as the CEO in the state was going to be a big hurdle to overcome. And my husband Brian said to me, he said, well, what do you think? What do you want to do? And I said, I think we run anyways. He said, okay, let's do it. Because I wanted to be home in the state. I had a passion for our state. I knew there was some big things that we could do. So I filed the paperwork, decided to run for governor, and we ran hard. I ran against our attorney general in the state in the primary and won that, and then got into a very tough election. I ended up winning by 3 points against a Bernie Sanders Democrat, which you would be surprised that one could do that well in South Dakota, but that tells you about the power of a story and media and campaigning. But we won, and I had the chance to serve as the first female South Dakota governor. I remember being sworn in the rotunda, and it not really hitting me about the fact that it was the 100th anniversary in South Dakota of women getting the right to vote, the same time I was being sworn in as the first female governor. And I've never been a feminist. I've never been a person who's really focused on men or women or differences. I do believe there needs to be a diversity of opinions around a table and a diversity of experiences around a table. I learned when I was in business, and I learned when I was serving in Congress, whatever position I was in, that we ended up with better decisions. We ended up with better policies if you had a diversity of debate around that table. In fact, one of the bills that I had gotten done and accomplished and signed into law when I was in Congress was one that required, whenever the United States goes into peace negotiations in any kind of a war dispute between countries, it requires that there must be a woman at the table in that peace negotiation. The reason was because statistically it showed that those peace negotiations that had a woman at the table during those talks was 30 to 40% more successful for a longer period of time, because many times in many of these countries, when the men are off to war or fighting, it was the women home running the businesses, taking care of the families, knew what it would take to maintain peace there, and were stepping up in incredible ways, and that everybody needed to be at that table to make sure that all the elements were there to maintain peace that would last longer and be what that country needed to be successful. So diversity of opinions was incredibly important to have. But I also recognized, when I was standing in that rotunda, seeing what it meant to people in that state to see this different kind of a person in a leadership role in our state. And I remember thinking, I better not screw up. This is a big deal. We went into 2019, and almost as soon as we got through our first legislative session, I was only on the job for a couple of months, when we got hit with a bomb cyclone. Have any of you seen what a bomb cyclone is? Well, I didn't know what a bomb cyclone was. We had not had one in South Dakota before, but essentially it was 6 feet of snow on the western half of South Dakota, 6 inches of rain on the eastern half of the state, and it was all on frozen ground, which meant that everything immediately flooded. 63 of our 66 counties were declared federal disaster areas. All I did for 2019 was flooding and FEMA and put communities back together and replace infrastructure. And we spent incredible amount of time helping people and families and businesses get through that difficult situation. I thought for sure 2020 is going to be so much better. We got into 2020, got through our first legislative session by the first week of March, and we had learned a couple of months before that about this virus that was overseas, that was coming to the United States of America, and I opened an emergency operations center in January preparing for it, and our first cases of the COVID virus came to South Dakota on March 10th, which just happened to be the anniversary of the day of my dad passing away. There's not much I like about March 10th. In fact, on that day, the day we got our first cases was the day we also lost 5 South Dakotans to the virus. So on the first day we could report a case was the day we already had losses. I remember thinking throughout that time period about all the challenges that we had. And I remember talking to other governors and other leaders during this time. And I'm sure for many of you, wherever you were in whatever state you were in, were watching things from afar and feel like the world had lost its mind. But we made very different decisions in South Dakota than virtually any other state. I kept coming back to every decision that I made on what authority I had as governor and what authority that I didn't have. See, I think I did every single thing that every other governor in this country did. We all talked to our experts. We all brought in our healthcare officials, those who were the researchers that understood maybe what we were facing. We all talked to those individuals that were working in our communities, those around the country and around the world that could give us any kind of insight and wisdom. I believe what I did different was I took it a step further. I spent a lot of time talking to my general counsel, to constitutional attorneys. I really wanted to understand what my role was as governor, what authority I had, but also what authority I didn't have. Because I'm a firm believer that when leaders overstep their authority, especially in a time of crisis, that's when we lose this country. That's really when we lose what makes America special. And I didn't want to be that governor that overstepped my authority and set a precedent that couldn't be drawn back. So, for instance, in our state, we never once closed a single business in our state during the entire pandemic. In fact, I didn't even define what an essential business was because I don't believe that governors have the authority to tell you that your business isn't essential. We never once mandated anything. What I did is I stood up in front of the people of our state and told them that we were going to get through this together, that we were going to help each other, that we were going to use personal responsibility, and that we would take care of each other. And overwhelmingly, we did. We saw incredible things happen during that time. We also saw the federal government come in with different assets and resources that would be necessary. One of the things to this day that I'm the most grateful for is that President Trump was in the White House during that time because he let me do my job. If Joe Biden had been in the White House during that time, he wouldn't have let me do my job as governor. But President Trump let me do my job and make the decisions in South Dakota that were right and that were good for our people and let me trust our people. In fact, if you all remember when the president offered those elevated unemployment benefits to everybody in the country, we were the only state in the country that never offered those elevated unemployment benefits. I said to the president, I said, thank you for the flexibility, but our people want to work, and they did. Today, we have the lowest unemployment rate in the entire country. In fact, we have the lowest unemployment rate in the history of our nation at 1.8% because everybody in our state kept working and understood the value of working. So today, as a result of what we did during the pandemic, we had an opportunity to tell our story. Now, as a result, we are one of the fastest growing states in the country. In fact, we've been growing up to 10 times faster than every other state in this country. Incomes are going up faster than anywhere else in the nation. Women-owned businesses are doing better than anywhere else in the country. Our birth rate is going up faster than anywhere else. Our housing developments are #1 in the nation for the amount of new houses that we're building. We had tens of thousands of people move into South Dakota and hundreds of businesses that picked up and came to our state, and they came because they wanted to be free. They came because they wanted to be trusted and they recognized that there could be opportunities. And what's the most interesting about all of that story and all of those amazing statistics is that also during this time, our mental health challenges went down, our suicides dropped, and our drug overdoses are continuing to go down when every other state is going up. And we proved that when you give people freedom, and when you give them liberty and you talk to them about taking care of each other and personal responsibility, that they're happier. You see, we were created, our purpose was to serve people. that when we serve people every day, we get up with a purpose on what we are to do, and we're happier, not just physically, but also mentally and spiritually, because we have a purpose every day that's beyond us. And the people of South Dakota understand that and recognize the value of that and what that can bring in benefits to them and to their family. In fact, what I think the story of our state is that's so powerful is that all we did in our state is what conservatives have always talked about, that they believe. We just did it, and we proved that it works. So many times I'm curious about why we get attacked, or why I get attacked so much, or why I get so many negative news articles, or why so many activist groups are constantly suing us or coming up after us. And I think it's because we're dangerous. The state of South Dakota and what we've been able to do is dangerous to the liberal thought in this country and what they've tried to perpetuate for lies about what America stands for. Because we actually did it, and now we don't have to talk about hope anymore. We can prove that it exists. That it exists, and it exists in the policies of free market and personal responsibility and liberty and low taxes and cutting regulations. And all of that is perpetuating an abundance in South Dakota that you don't see across this country, and economic growth and development that other states aren't enjoying. It's been fantastic to see what has happened in our state. We've had historic revenues and broken every revenue dollar amount that the state has ever had in South Dakota because of the economic benefits we've had from people coming in and businesses thriving and doing well. In fact, our largest industry is agriculture, but our second largest industry is tourism. And we have broken every tourism record that is. And most people that came to visit us in 2020, do you remember those commercials we put out inviting everybody to come and visit South Dakota when the rest of the country was shut down? Well, people overwhelmingly came. And then they went home and got their families and moved to our state. And they live with us now. But we think it's absolutely wonderful. In 2020, while everybody else was shut down, we kept hosting events that brought people together. I'm sure many of you remember hearing about the Sturgis Motorcycle Bike Rally. We had concerts. We had the very first professional sporting event that was held with spectators fully held after the pandemic was announced. We had the first PGA tournament that was held that had spectators in it in our state of South Dakota. We had the opportunity to show that people could still be together, they could still be wise and smart and responsible, but that life could go on normal and that you could protect people's constitutional rights. We've stood for so many of those in our state that I think people understand the benefits of. One of the very first bills I brought as governor in 2019 and introduced was a civics bill. A civics bill that said that our kids in our K-12 system needed to know more history, and they needed to understand our background and our foundational beliefs. Did you know that first legislative session, my Republicans overwhelmingly killed that bill? They said it would be too much work to change the curriculum, that our teachers didn't need to have more responsibility, and that it was going to be too hard. Look at how the conversation has shifted just a couple of years later. Now, overwhelmingly, they're on board. They've helped me make sure that we redid our standards and have the best standards in the nation now for our kids. But it's amazing how most of the time, those first couple of years, the people that we have to convince to get on board are Republicans. Convince them to make sure that they're standing for the right principles and the benefits. The first bill that I signed into law was constitutional carry. It was so that our constitutional rights to protect our Second Amendment rights would be protected in our state. In fact, we've waived all fees in the South Dakota for any requirement to carry any kind of a firearm, and I also pay for your background checks. For I believe that we're the only state in the nation that it won't cost you a penny to exercise your Second Amendment rights as well. And during the riots and violence that we saw in 2020, when the rest of the world was melting down and disrespecting law enforcement officers, it made me angry. So I instead decided to do a national advertising campaign to law enforcement that said, if you want to live somewhere where people respect you, if you want to live somewhere where people will wrap their arms around your family and love you, then come to South Dakota. That very first week, over 800 law enforcement officers raised their hands and said, we want to move to South Dakota. And since then, thousands of them have come to our state to make themselves at home. If we become known as a state that is filled up with law enforcement officers, then I'm okay with that. I think that is absolutely amazing. And again, when we started to see President Biden's policies starting to impact inflation and starting to impact the national economy, and we saw states start to withdraw and start to hang on to dollars and be conservative, again in South Dakota, we decided to make a different choice. Perhaps maybe you've seen some of these commercials on TV recently. Have you? When everybody else was out there trying to figure out how they were going to be able to deal with the workforce shortages in this country, how they were going to fill open jobs and get people off their butts and back into a job, I decided that we needed to go on steroids and start talking about the value of a work ethic and recruiting people to come to our state to fill our open jobs. Because our businesses were thriving so much in South Dakota, I needed workers, and I know that the state that has the workers is the state that's going to thrive, the state that will win the economic race. So we started this national advertising campaign, and you've had the chance to see me up close and personal be a very bad electrician and a really lousy plumber and welder and dentist, but they're working. They're working in incredible ways. We've had since then over 5,000 families that have gone through the process of moving to South Dakota and are continuing to advertise to more and more people going out there and saying, if you want to come to South Dakota, come here. And we are working with them one-on-one to make sure we're answering all their questions on what kind of a school district they want their kids to be in, what kind of a community do they want to live in, and facilitating them to come and move their families to our state. That advertising campaign called Freedom Works Here has only been going for a couple of months, but we've already seen over 5,000 different people and families respond to say, we want to make South Dakota our new home, and we're going to keep it up. It's been by far the most successful workforce campaign in the history of our state, and it has got our business owners thankful that we have people that recognize the value of having a job and the value of being a part of our state and recognizing what a privilege it is. If any of you want to be a welder or a plumber or an electrician, the lights did come back on the Capitol Dome, by the way. But South Dakota is an incredible place to do it. In fact, what we did was licensing reform and apprenticeship reform. So now people can move to South Dakota and we will recognize virtually every single license that they have. If they want to come be a nurse or a teacher, that very first day they can get to work. And then I fixed our apprenticeship program so that even people can come and be in a job and be trained while they're earning a wage and receiving health care and retirement benefits. So many people that maybe are 30 years old, 40 years old, wanted to go from making a $20 to $25 an hour job into being a fully licensed plumber or a teacher in a classroom. They can work in that classroom or on that job and continue to earn their wage, and we will facilitate them getting the education that they need so that they can end up getting their own certificate and their own license and end up having the career they've always dreamed of. This year we've got over 100 individuals who've been teachers' aides that will be licensed teachers while they're on the job working with our kiddos, and they're receiving health care and retirement benefits and will be able to have their own classroom in the future because of the streamlining and the efficiencies that we built into that process. So there's incredible opportunities going on that I think every other state just needs to look at in order to build on to be successful and to help families. Here's my story, is that we've watched a lot of the debates and elections and what's going on with the narrative that the rest of the country is having, and I think many people would turn on the news or read a newspaper or website and get discouraged. I want to be here today to give you a bit of encouragement, that there is no reason to be discouraged, because I believe for the very first time in a long time, we have real life examples that we can point to that shows that what we believe works, that what we have for policies really does create opportunities, does help lift people up, that the American dream is still out there, and there's people in this country that are living it every single day and thriving because of it. That's a powerful tool that we can use to make sure that we have the right leaders in the right positions at the right time. Because leadership has consequences, it's more important now than ever that we don't get drugged down into the ugliness of an election season. And we forget to tell our stories that have proven out that what we believe as conservatives, as Americans, isn't divisive, isn't something that is negative. It's something that lifts people with a hope that has been proven out. You know, it was Ronald Reagan's speech, A Time for Choosing, which he called forever after just the speech, because every other speech would be measured after that one, because it was such a powerful example. But in that, he talked about that you and I have a rendezvous with destiny, that we have a rendezvous with destiny that we will preserve for our children, or we will be the last hope of men here on earth, or sentence them to the first step into 1,000 years of darkness. Let us be the first step of man into hope. That rendezvous of destiny and that vision that he cast for us needs to be something that we grasp again. I had one time, I'll close with this, I had a pastor tell me many, many years ago, he talked about, was giving a sermon, but talked about being offended. And he said to me afterwards when I was talking to him about his sermon that day, he said, Kristi, we have the chance to get offended every single day. He said, people are going to walk by you and they are going to throw out offenses. And you're the one who decides if you want to pick it up and carry it around with you. But then you're the one that's carrying the burden. He said, you have the opportunity every day that when someone throws an offense out at you to walk by and let it lay there and not pick it up. Listen, we need to get over ourselves. We've gotten so offended by people that we've quit talking to each other, that we've quit having conversations. We can't even have civil discourse anymore because we've been so offended by people in our lives or people that we work with or people in our church or people in our family. And I'm going to ask all of you right now that during this presidential election season and so many consequential races, that we just make a decision to get over ourselves, that we start talking and having those conversations again. And we don't have to have all the answers. Let's start by listening. Nobody feels like they're being listened to anymore. Start listening, asking questions, and not pick up those offenses when they get thrown out there. That's how we bring this country back together. And that's how we start using the examples we've seen from state to state on what leadership did to each and every state, how the leader in that state made a difference. There's no question that conservative leaders that were in positions over states during this pandemic did better, that those states did better and their families did better and they thrived. Those who tried to lock down and take away freedoms and use fear to control people struggled and had hardships and still are struggling. Let's be the hope. Let's be the hope that they all want to embrace and hold on to and point to the examples of hope that we have each and every day. Can you do that for me? All right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for allowing me to be with all of you today. Hi, Philip. How are you?
Oh, thank you, Governor. Good to see you.
Yeah. Do you have a chair you prefer?
I do, right here. Well, it's up to you. Dealer's choice.
That's good.
All right, Governor. I was taking notes during your remarks, and there's a lot of very serious follow-ups that I want to get to. And in preparation for this interview, I was looking at your record on COVID, what you did and what you didn't do. I want to get your views on foreign policy, on the economy. I even went back and looked at your congressional voting record. But the thing that I keep coming back to, and I want an answer to this question.
Sure.
A definitive yes or no on the record.
Okay.
Do you own a flamethrower?
I do. I have a flamethrower. Did you guys know that?
You own?
Yeah, so you were the first
Wait,
one that actually...
You own this flamethrower?
No, I don't own that one.
You own a different
That's
flamethrower.
the one that made me want to own a flamethrower. Yeah.
Why?
So do any of you have flamethrowers? Okay, so if you have one, you never have to ask that question again. I was at a hunting lodge and somebody had a flamethrower, and they're kind of remarkable, actually. So I finally got one for Christmas this last Christmas. My staff gave it to me. But if you get a flamethrower, it's a little bit like getting your first chainsaw. I remember when I got my first chainsaw, I just kind of walked around like, what else can I cut? So.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Yes,
Governor Kristi Noem.
Yes, there we go.
There's no question that I can ask that's going to get a better answer.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
I'll try.
There's not a reason to need a flamethrower. They're just fun, and they come with accessories. So if you do have a flamethrower, they have an extra gas tank, so they last longer. They come with a sling.
All right,
so
all right.
now I've got accessories for
So
my flamethrower.
Rolling Stone magazine sarcastically
Oh, my
called
goodness.
you the queen of COVID for not mandating mask mandates, for not shutting down, for not having lockdown orders. But in retrospect, a lot of conservatives focus on your approach about protecting the most vulnerable and not trying to limit cases overall. And they say that you did the right thing. So my question to you is, how did you get it right when the White House and DC Republicans got it so wrong?
Well, conservatives didn't say that about me right away. If you remember, there was nobody who had my back. During the pandemic, us as governors would get on the phone and have conference calls a couple of times a week. We would talk about different information. It was all off the record and just governor-only calls, but talk about, well, what are you learning about the virus? What are you, but there wasn't anybody that was defending what I was deciding. We would, on those calls, have very candid conversations, and when a governor would say, I'm gonna shut businesses down, I'm gonna not have these events, I kept asking, well, how do you determine that you as a governor have the authority to do that? And for most of them, it was, well, my folks are telling me I need to. My folks are telling me my healthcare officials don't have my back. They say I need to. It wasn't based in a constitutional authority that they had in their goal. So I understand it was a very scary time. And I think what was interesting was for all of us, the weight of the fact that it literally was up to us to decide. I had an amazing executive team that would have debate and discussion with me over every decision I was making, but then they all would look at me and say, now you just need to decide. And that was a heavy, heavy responsibility. In fact, what I did to kind of survive that time, and it was a hard time, was to quit watching the news. I didn't watch the nightly news. I didn't even know, and then you have all these wonderful friends that feel like they have to call you the next day and say, did you see what Elizabeth Warren said about you last night? I'm like, no, I'm trying to stay away from what she's saying about me. But that was challenging because every other governor closed their businesses too. Everybody did. In fact, I had one governor that just this last year had me come to his state to do an event with him, and he stood up in front of a room of 300 people, and he said, I want Kristi to know that during COVID, when she didn't lock down her state and she was the only one, I want to thank her for that publicly, because when she did that, she gave us cover. He said she gave us cover as the rest of the governors that we could then start opening up our states again too. And he said it was almost like, because you had been so firm on that, it gave the rest of us the chance to say, okay, well, now we're not the only ones, and open our states back up. So it was a lonely time. I think that's what most people wouldn't ever really know, is how isolating it truly was.
So I assume if Dr. Fauci had been on your staff, you wouldn't have kept him around.
No, I would not have kept Dr. Fauci around. And I mean, ultimately, Dr. Fauci had the authority he was given.
And I want to zero in on that. Was it a mistake for Donald Trump not to tell Dr. Anthony Fauci, you're fired?
I do believe so, but I also think that, a president has certain information that makes it to his level and doesn't have certain information that makes it to his level.
So at what point, I mean, I think a lot of people would look back at the March and April when we didn't know a lot about this virus. But as we got into the summer, for instance, when Dr. Fauci was saying that these large outdoor gatherings in protest of the killing of George Floyd, those were okay.
Right.
But then there were a lot of conservatives saying, wait a minute, why
Attacking
can't I
us
go to
for
church?
our July 3rd event.
I remember that very well. So at that point, when he knew more about the virus, when there were voices like you saying that there's another approach, should he have given Dr. Fauci the boot?
It's frustrating for me. I didn't understand why they weren't. There's leaders have different information in the room making their decisions. I felt like many times President Trump didn't necessarily have a team around him that gave him the information he needed. If you noticed, and if you remember during the pandemic, he also put the vice president in charge of the COVID pandemic. And so the vice president was making a lot of decisions on who spoke at press conferences, who we gave credibility to. That was one of the issues I kept raising to the White House, is I had seen for years Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx running around Washington, D.C. with all the liberals as their friends. They were friends with Nancy Pelosi, and I had seen them when I served in Congress together, and I kept saying, why are we giving credibility to people that we know politically someday may undermine us?
Yeah.
You know,
I think
they're such political individuals, why would we stand them up and give them that credibility?
And it's that perspective, and I want to move quickly here, but you know a lot of these folks who were on stage at that debate. For instance, Senator Tim Scott was also the freshman liaison to leadership with you for, I think it was the 112th Congress. So I want to go quickly here, and I want to get your reaction to the debate on a few questions. Well, first, let's just see, you know, on that debate stage, was there anyone who impressed you? Was there anyone who disappointed you? Did you watch the debate?
I did watch the debate. You know, it's hard because you criticize the debate. First of all, it's very hard to step up and to run for office. Very hard to debate. And I'll make it clear, I don't enjoy debates. You know, when I have to do them, you know, I dread them and prepare and over-prepare and don't sleep. So it's very challenging. So for people to sit back and to criticize, I think is okay. You can give an analysis, but it takes a lot of courage to step on that stage, and I give each one of them props for doing it. I would say the first 15 minutes of that debate was extremely discouraging for me. I do not conduct my job interviews for staff that way. We are electing the leader of the free world. So what I watched happen on that stage, and the yelling and the crowd and the lack of respect for the moderators, for me was very disheartening. It made it hard to watch the rest of it.
Well, so then how about you provide some of the substance, and we have to move quickly here. Provide some of the substance that we didn't hear on that debate stage. I want quick answers on these. For instance, with regards to Ukraine, is the United States taking its eye off the ball with regards to the threat from China by continuing aid to Ukraine?
I think it's sending a message to China that China isn't our number one threat. And that is, you know, our foreign policy is not one-dimensional, which is the conversation they had on that stage that night. We can still support Ukraine defending itself from Russia without just talking about it only in dollars and cents. There's a dozen different ways that we can show strength against Russia. Number one, we could start drilling on our lands and in our waters again and pursuing an all of the above American energy supply. We can crush them in the energy sector tomorrow if we just had a leader in the White House that just decided and starve Russia and show them that we mean boss. Instead, we're talking out of both sides of our mouth, and then they think they have all power in the world to go out and annex Crimea and go in and invade Ukraine. But China's the elephant in the room that is about to step on our throat. I mean, they not only have been building up their military, they've been stealing our IP, manipulating our currency. I've been talking for 20 years about them buying up our entire food supply chain. They own our chemical companies, our fertilizer companies, they own our genetics now, our processing facilities. I've been drawing a lot of attention the last several months to the fact that they own our prescription drug supply. The vast majority of the ingredients for our drugs come out of China and are manufactured in India. If the power that China has right now that the White House is not taking seriously is devastating to the United States of America.
The second thing that provided a bit of difference between those folks who were on stage was the issue of abortion. Should there be a national abortion ban, or, as Nikki Haley says, is that just an impossibility?
I don't think it's an impossibility, and the fact that she said that's a bit alarming to me, because we've seen some impossible things happen in this country, and that's the beauty of America. I think the reality of it happening in the next 6 months to a year, or before there's really strong election changes and different representation, you know, that may be more of a realistic dynamic. But I think a conversation of this, they're using to divide people, when the spirit of what she was saying was people coming together on a policy. I don't get to wake up in the morning and be a dictator. You know, South Dakota had a law on the books that when the Roe v. Wade decision came down, that law was automatically implemented. Everybody knows that I'm pro-life, but I had no authority or decision-making over that law, and I don't get to decide because the people in our state got to decide. So there's federal policy being debated on if it's possible or not possible. I think they'll continue to talk about that, but at the end of the day, we need to continue to talk about the value of states, the value of the people weighing in on their policy and their laws, because that's what makes this country special.
I appreciate that answer. That's not the typical politician answer. That's a straightforward explanation of aspirations and then also reality. So I appreciate that. That's helpful. One of the elephants that was in the room, well, there was a big elephant who wasn't in the room, but there was also one who was former Vice President Mike Pence. And this was a question that was placed to all of the candidates, and I want to place it to you. Do you think that Mike Pence did the right thing by certifying the 2020 election?
I believe he did. I do. And I think that the fact that he still feels the need to be so crabby about it is sad. You know, he obviously is feeling the criticism and the attacks, but if you're a patriot and you love this country, you'll be satisfied in the fact that you know you did the right thing.
So you did the right thing and move on.
Yeah, well,
okay.
I do. I just think that it was interesting for me to watch him on that stage try to get every single candidate to say he was right. If I spent every day going back and trying to make everybody else say that I was right, I would never get to sleep at night. So move on, do something big, have a vision, tell us why we should vote for you.
I want to switch gears with the limited amount of time that we have here. There was some national attention to some of the decisions that you made with girls' sports and places that were specifically for young women. And I want to ask you, just to get down to brass tacks, what happens if tomorrow in South Dakota, someone like Leah Thomas, a biological male, showed up to compete against the South Dakota Lady Coyotes at a swim meet? What would happen?
It would not be allowed. We have the strongest bill in the country to protect girls' sports and women's sports in our state. And I think, Philip, what's important here is for all of you to look clearly at what you were told by the media and what in reality happened in South Dakota.
So let me get to that, because I've got the follow-up here, because
Right.
there was criticism from some of your friends on the right. And you issued a style-informed veto of HB 127, and you noted that if South Dakota passed that legislation, contrary to NCAA policy, that they could take punitive action against your state. The next year you signed similar legislation into law, and you were happy to do so. You had a big press conference. So,
Oh, you're skipping so much.
well,
Philip.
you'll have
you
a
gotta
chance to
tell
explain.
the truth. Come on.
That's
What
part of the
hap-
job description.
You're
So
right.
why was economic pressure, which you cited, why was that even part of the consideration?
Who cited
Wouldn't it-
economic pressure?
You did in a National Review
No,
op-ed and in your Tucker Carlson interview as well. So, but respond to those critics. Why would it matter that the NCAA could keep a tournament out of South Dakota if the issue is protecting young girls and women? Why was that even part of the consideration?
Because we would have lost that case in court. That was the main reason for passing a policy that was not flawed. So back when I was in Congress, years before the girls' sports conversation even started, they came after the sport of rodeo. USDA came out with a policy that said you could no longer have women's events in rodeo and men's events in rodeo, and said it had to be eliminated. So back in Congress, I had already fought this
And that was
fight.
2017. That
It
was much earlier.
Yes,
You were on the ball on this.
It was. And I had to fight and go to war in order for the the sport of rodeo nationally to be able to protect girls' events and boys' events. So I'd already been down that road. The problem was that my legislature had passed a very flawed bill that I sent back to them with changes that I would sign immediately into law. And they instead chose to kill the bill. What nobody talks about, Philip, is the fact that that very same day that my legislature killed that bill, I signed an executive order to protect girls' sports. So until we passed the strongest bill in the nation and signed it into law, I had an executive order protecting girls' sports in place the entire year to make sure that we didn't have a situation where boys were in girls' sports and had the chance to normalize it. I knew, and this is the decision that you don't always get to hear on the nightly news or in a tweet. I don't get the luxury of signing flawed bills. I don't get the luxury of signing something into law because I don't want to get attacked and it's good enough. Because if I sign something that has poor language in it, that's flawed, that I can't defend in court, and then it immediately ends up getting challenged and thrown into court, which the NCAA would have done, which activist liberals would have done, is challenge that bill had I signed it the way the legislature gave it to me, and they would have won. And it would have gotten thrown out. I would have lost all ability to protect girls' sports, and it would have set up a precedent that would have set my whole argument backwards in the state of South Dakota from passing strong legislation in the future. So for me, even though I knew that the legislature and my enemies and those who were already attacking me, I would be giving them a narrative that they could, I had to do the right thing.
Yeah.
Keep an executive order in place, make sure I had the right bill that could withstand a court challenge, and make sure that when I did sign law, that it was going to be something I could defend and would strengthen our argument to make sure our women had opportunities.
So this was an issue of you were right on the principle, a conservative would say, and this was a prudential question of getting all of your ducks in a row so that you could put that principle in place.
Correct.
Okay.
If we sign bills that have flaws in them into law and we lose that challenge in court, it hurts the cause. It hurts us from being able to win. We've seen that in so many different issues. If you build up a court case precedent and lose an important one, it's used for multiple decisions that go forward after that. So it's important for me, as someone who's always thinking 3 or 4 steps ahead, I have literally in my office, every time someone in my staff looks at any bill that gets brought in South Dakota, any legislator proposes a bill or we bring one, they have to do a bill analysis. They have to tell me what happens if this bill becomes law. What happens if this bill doesn't become law? The last sentence that they have to answer, my staff has to go through to answer, to tell me really what this bill, but the last question is, what happens to the next generation if this bill gets signed into law? I don't want my staff thinking, politically in the next 6 months, how will the governor get attacked if she does or doesn't sign this bill? I want them thinking, what happens to our kids and our grandkids if this bill gets signed into law? What happens to our kids and grandkids if it doesn't?
So we could stay here all day, and I have a sneaking suspicion that your name will come up more in the news. I have 2 buckets of questions that I want to get to before we let you go. The first is, I want your analysis on this, because Kari Lake argued earlier this year that while social issues are important, and this is a direct quote now, quote, the 2024 election will be about fixing our economy and preventing World War III. So what do you make of that dichotomy? Do you think Kari Lake is right, or can you have a mix of both social issues and economic issues?
I would say the national security issue should be the biggest consideration because we're at such a dangerous, unprecedented time. Economically, families are being devastated by policies we have right now. But the social issues just are going to be a factor. Whether Kari Lake says they are or aren't, whether anybody else in this country says they are or aren't, they are going to be, just because of people will use them as a weapon to try to destroy people. Mm-hmm. And that, unfortunately, they've been able to see results with in the past. So whether we think they should be or they shouldn't be, we better be prepared to talk about them all, because they're going to be used. You made headlines when you invited former President Donald Trump to the South Dakota Monuments Dinner. I think that's going to be in September. You've also made headlines saying that you would consider the vice presidency. I know that you two talk pretty frequently. I have that on good authority. So have you talked with the former president about potentially joining his ticket? We have not talked about that topic. We do talk quite often. I would say that I was asked if I would consider it, and I said, of course I would consider it. But I think every single one of you in this room, if you were asked, should consider it. You really should, because it is such an unprecedented time. And if you aren't willing to be all in on doing everything that you can to really protect the United States of America, then you should really start questioning whether you really appreciate what the gift was that you were given. Because listen, I meet people every day that tell me, oh, I'm not going to do that. That's too hard. I might be criticized. I'm not going to say that. And I would say that's exactly how we ended up where we are today. Is there anything about what happened during the previous Republican administration, about the very public divorce that we see playing out between Trump and Pence, that gives you pause as you make that consideration? Well, yes, because I've always been the boss, So for me and my personality, it's, for me, I've known from the beginning, since I was little, that my personality is I like to be the one making the decisions. So yes, I do think that that's what would be a consideration that I would have to fully vet and think through before you accept a position to be a part of a ticket like that.
Gotcha. Well, Governor, we could stay here all day. I'm glad that I got you on the record about the flamethrower.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I really
Thank you.
appreciate it. Thank you, Governor.
Fantastic. Thank you.